The themes of loneliness and isolation are addressed in the text Hear the Wind Sing by Haruki Murakami and Lovely by Billie Eilish and Khalid. Um, Eilish addresses the issue of loneliness through this use of space and location while combining that with metaphor, while Murakami employs indirect metaphor. And he sort of brings about this concept of light in order to treat the issue of isolation. To begin with, Hear the Wind Sing is a short story tells sort of a relationship between a man and a woman who are getting to know each other. The man is the narrator, and the woman is a woman he was sort of set up with by another friend, and she actually only has 4 fingers, and she's sort of clearly troubled. But they're sort of trying to build this intimate relationship. And in this scene that I selected, they are sitting at a shipyard at nighttime, and they're looking out over the dock where all the ships are docked in, and they're looking out over the ocean. And they said, and the narrator says, we sat for a long time just looking at the ocean. And immediately I saw an aesthetic of Yugen here, right? This idea that there's beauty in those moments that bring awe, that sort of stop our heart and make us recognize, the vast, fluid, and chaotic nature of life. Later on, after she kind of shares some pain and some difficult struggle with the narrator, she says to him, "You're the first person I've ever told." And so I think it's because of this moment of awe where she's able to sort of stop and recognize that there's something beautiful transpiring here, that she's able to be vulnerable. And she shares something for which she has shame. And I think that it's only in these moments of awe that we can kind of open ourselves up to the destructive beauty of the world, right? And walk away from maybe the shame and isolation and start moving towards it. And so we can really see this in the text where he uses this idea of an indirect metaphor. He doesn't directly say one thing compares to another, but he does sort of compare the shipyard to the 4-fingered girl. He describes the shipyard as, the boats that are there, the flanks of the boats were caked with barnacles, like a sick man's scabs. When we think about barnacles, right, they're these like hard, rough little crustaceans that form on the bottom of a boat, like right below the surface of the water. And they come from the chaos of the sea, right? The sea, bashes up against the boat, and it creates this, especially in areas where there's lots of erosion in the water, we find these barnacles sort of growing on something. And so the barnacles on the boat sort of represent the rough, tough parts of the ocean that can conspire when we experience the ocean. On the other hand, the 4-fingered girl is, when she describes her pain to the narrator, she talks about having these violent voices in her head that live in her headspace, and it creates it, very difficult to live. And these voices, say some really awful, terrible things to her. And she asks the narrator, do you think I'm sick? And I think that, what's interesting is I sort of see the ships and her as similar, and the barnacles on the ships are, also representative of, scars and wounds that come from the battle of the ocean. And these voices and things she's hearing in her head are also representative of the wounds, the scars that sort of exist after we've experienced life. They're both depicted, both the ships and the girl, as being sick, right? When we think of sick people, we think of brokenness and possibly dangerous, contagious, something you want to stay away from, something that's frowned upon in society. And so, the ship and her both have these sort of beat up, broken parts of themselves. And frankly, she's ashamed of those broken parts. She thinks that her voices make her sick, make her crazy, because that's how the world would see it, right? And so she's bothered by this sickness and therefore tries to hide it. She tries to hide it from people in order to keep herself safe. Concurrently, Murakami incorporates many references to light throughout this moment as well. He says the lights of the dock were, straight ahead. When we think about light, we think about hope and new beginnings and love, almost holy stuff, right? When things are lit up, there's something really admirable about them. When he said that the lights were pointing straight ahead, that idea of straight ahead means that, they're looking forward. That the two of them sitting together in this Yugen-ish moment are looking towards the future and not looking towards the past, which again inspires an idea of hope. He uses words like illuminating, which means, if you illuminate something, you're essentially decorating it or lighting it up or making it be seen because it's worthy of being seen. And another part at the end, after she shared her experience, he says, the stars twinkled above the dock. And the dock is supposed to be this sort of beat down, gross place, but the stars are up there twinkling. And so we think of stars that usually represent the past. The heavens, time. They're traditionally an ancient symbol of direction and hope. So again, we have this idea of like forward momentum and hope. And so when he says that they're twinkling above a sick-looking dock, essentially these stars are shining light on something that is ultimately dark. And so I think what's interesting here is that fear is often created because we look at the past or the future, right? Like, oh, I'm afraid this will happen, or this did happen, and now I'm afraid it's gonna hurt me. When she looks forward, though, she's able to sort of illuminate those dark parts of herself. And so in this scene, it's the boat who is getting the lightness from the stars and from the lights on the dock, and that's what's illuminating that darkness. But in this moment, when these two are able to build this intimate relationship and sit in this moment of awe, I get the feeling that the narrator is really sort of her light, right? That's the lightness that's bringing her buoyancy. And so in this ephemeral moment, there is sort of this representation of direction and hope for her. And he's sort of that guiding light to get her there. Comparingly, we can see this theme of fear and isolation in the song Lovely by Billie Eilish and Khalid. And initially in this song, I mean, it's clearly about loneliness and how she's trying to no avail to get out of the loneliness. She says at the beginning, I hope I'll make it out, looking for a better place. This line implies that anything is better than loneliness, right? Looking for a better place. So it's not great necessarily, but anything is better than where she's at, which is in this state of loneliness. It makes the reader feel like she's stuck, right? Like she's trapped in this idea. Later on, she continues to then say, isn't it lovely all alone? And so that's interesting because it's a contradictory idea from how she initially introduces the loneliness. When we think of lovely in that word, it represents, things that are beautiful and graceful. And so immediately when I read that, I thought, oh, well, this could be sarcasm because she's clearly not happy with this lonely state. But then she says this. And so when I read further, I understand this idea of survival. She says, I need a place to hide, as though if like hiding from this loneliness will save her, right? It's like a survival thing. It's a requirement. She's got to hide from this thing. But she can't hide from it because she's literally trapped in it. She can't get out of this place. There's nowhere to go. She hopes for one in the future. She can't get out. And so maybe since she's sort of stuck in this place, she's attempting to then make it lovely, right? She paints an idea of a different place, a lovely place, because it's the only way she can sort of survive. Essentially, like maybe, you have to make something lovely in order to make it through. Which I think is a genuine commentary by Billie Eilish. I don't think she's really trying to be sarcastic in this moment. Secondly, she focuses on this idea of like space and location. She talks about the loneliness and her state of being as like a place that she's in. She uses words like home, here, hide, where, outside, and these all reference location. And when we think about loneliness and sadness, we really sort of consider it in the mind, not like a place I'm going to go to or a place I'm going to get away from. And so in that regard, she references this place in her head and she begins with hiding from it. But eventually she moves to like welcoming it. And she literally says, welcome home, which sort of implies that she's accepting and allowing this sadness to exist and to be. She's stuck in this dark place all alone. And since she can't get out, she essentially, makes a home of the pain. Right? She takes domestic quarters in order to like concede to the loneliness and be like, fine, I give in. I will just honor you and make you lovely. Ultimately, though, the part that gets me the most is when she personifies the mind as though it has destructive power. She first talks about it as a place, and then later it kind of takes on these human characteristics. Again, coming back to that place where she says, I need a place to hide, right? Like when we are hiding or we feel the need to hide, typically that means something or someone is looking for you, right? Like you you need to hide from something that can actually find you or see you. Um, Additionally, she says, she refers to the pain of the loneliness as, she says, it tear me to pieces, skin to bone. This is a really interesting piece of imagery for me because tear me to pieces from my skin to my bone, that sounds like something an animal would do, right? It's really animalistic. A tiger or a bear would rip apart skin to get to the bone. And so it's got this sort of like natural biological part of the process and the system of the mind. And still this feeling that you can't escape. If there was a tiger or a bear attacking you and ripping your skin to shreds, you wouldn't make it. And so the mind is almost being represented as like this brutal animal that she has to hide from. In order to protect herself, she has to accept the situation that she's in. And so ultimately, when the mind traps us, we must make ourselves at home, right? When we are entrapped, you have to make that space as homely or lovely as you possibly can. And so ultimately, both authors sort of reveal the struggle of isolation and loneliness. But I suggest they both offer a unique perspective on how to move through it. On one hand, Eilish implies that one must make the loneliness lovely in order to make it through the pain. And on the other, Murakami doesn't see it as creating or holding space, but rather allowing yourself to be illuminated by others in order to shine light on the darkest places of your being.